So Randy Moody's our next speaker, and he's also the chair of the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation Board in Canada, and he's also on our board. So Randy's going to talk to you about some kind of sheep or something.
That's right. What's this for? People wearing this?
Oh yeah, put that on.
I wear this?
You wear that.
Okay.
It's big daddy watching you.
What is it? Anyway, okay, I'll wear this little... Okay. I know it's getting late in the day, people are getting tired, which you'll be happy to hear that this is probably the shortest talk of the day, so nice late time slot for this. Is BC the black sheep of whitebark pine? Yes. Thank you. So really, what this talk is about is British Columbia, there we go. BC has 56% of the whitebark pine range is in Canada, and 76% of that range, of the Canadian range, is in BC. So we have roughly 40% of the entire range of the species. It goes all the way from the 49th parallel here, up north here, north of Fort St. James region. So it's got quite an extensive range in British Columbia. But BC is also characterized by a lot of other endangered species. We've got 754 red-listed species, 757 blue-listed species. We like to color our species in BC. And we've got 164 species on the SARA list that may have changed since I looked that up. But so that's kind of what BC is about. And here's what whitebark pine looks like in BC in some places. This is in the Chilcotin area. We've got where whitebark pine forms some incredibly pure stands that are very they're still fully functioning the way a lot of people think of whitebark pine when they're drawn into whitebark pine. You learn about the grizzly bear and the nutcracker and all these relationships, and you think, what a great story. And this is still happening in the Chilcotin region, so you have a lot of that happening. A lot of stands like this. It's very common. In fact, the Engelmann Spruce Subalpine Fir Association is almost non-existent in a lot of valleys there. It just grades up into pure whitebark. Then you've got this type of situation through most of British Columbia and the Rockies and the Wet Belt and the North Cascades types, where stands are quite a bit more sparse and you have a lot more mortality in the whitebark pine. And but then you also see this kind of stand too, where we have a pure stand. This is in the Chilcotin as well, at lower elevations, where the beetle came through, as was rust in the stand, and you get a lot of mortality there. So we do have a lot of the impacts to whitebark pine in BC, as Michael mentioned earlier as well. But we also see a lot of this in BC. This is a small scale cutting. This is just cutting along the mountain bike trail. But we do see a lot of cutting of whitebark pine in BC. So if you were at the talks yesterday, you would have heard I mentioned forestry and mining and pipelines and all these industries impact whitebark pine still. And so I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, but wait, isn't whitebark pine legally protected? Like, so what about SARA? There's the SARA listing, and isn't that supposed to protect whitebark pine in BC? Well, it doesn't really work that way. That technically only applies to, well, more or less seems to apply to federal lands. And we've got our two fearless leaders here. This is Premier Christy Clark. That's the face she makes when you tell her about whitebark pine. And the province really doesn't care that much about whitebark pine. Then we've got our Prime Minister here. This is hunky Justin Trudeau getting ready for a boxing match. And as I mentioned, Sarah is federal. He's ready to fight for whitebark pine. So this is the situation we have in BC. We've got these two conflicting set of laws. And it really provides a lot of confusion for how we manage the species and how it's protected and how it's regulated. So in fact, this was I just reprinted this or retyped this right off the government website that says there is no standalone legislation in BC for species and ecosystems at risk. Instead, these provincial and federal laws collectively govern how at-risk populations and habitats are managed. And it lists all these acts. So instead of having one Species at Risk Act, you're supposed to refer to the Wildlife Act, the Forest Range Practice Act, the Oil and Gas Activities Act, the Ecological Reserve Act. All these acts collectively are supposed to act as some sort of a Species at Risk Act. So you can just imagine how confusing it is to be a government regulator who's supposed to be looking after things, and you've got all these acts to worry about, or you're building a pipeline or something, and so this just causes utter chaos. And of course, the bottom two ones, Species at Risk Act and Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, also apply sometimes. If, for example, you're putting in a mine and it's very large, you'll trigger a federal review. So there's a massive amount of confusion because they have all these acts that are supposed to be acting like Species at Risk Act, but they don't. So we'll look closer at the Forest and Range Practices Act. So within that, and this leads into what this is tied in with wildlife, there's something called Identified Wildlife Strategy, which it still doesn't give you any legal protection, but it provides consistent guidance. And so the way a lot of things work, if you put a permit in British Columbia, if it comes across my desk, I will definitely say that whitebark pine is important, and you need to consider that in your permit. But if it goes across somebody else's desk down the hall, and they're not a whitebark pine aficionado, they may not bring up whitebark pine on the permit requirement. So if you think about all those species at risk that were mentioned in one of the earlier slides, there's that many species to consider in BC. So a lot of species get missed during permit applications because the regulator doesn't know about them. But if you get something added to the Identified Wildlife Strategy, that helps them boil up to the top, up to the surface. So they're still not legally protected, but they're more likely to appear on all permits because they're in everyone's view now. And so it's been brought to the surface. So this seems like something we need to pursue for whitebark pine, which, if you read, this was straight off the Identified Wildlife Strategy website. The list of identified wildlife will be updated annually and will reflect changes in COSEWIC and Species at Risk Act listings. That was in 2004. Annually and reflect changes in COSEWIC and Species at Risk Act listing. The most recent update to this list was in 2006. So even though it's supposed to happen annually, it's not. So just to be blunt, it isn't. So anyway, what was that? Anyway, this is the Forest Range Practices Act. This is some of the legislation under that. And that's what perhaps we should work with the most in BC, because we are known for being a forestry-based economy, and perhaps that's where we're going to have the most bang for our buck, is by working with forestry. So if you're a true Canadian, you will know what this is about. If you're... anyway, this talk was also sponsored by the National Film Board of Canada. That'll mean something to some of you. So anyway, forestry in BC. I'm going to go touch a little bit on that, because we are such a forest-based economy. We should have that side of whitebark management dialed. We should be good at that. This is actually a log driver. He's floating logs down the river to the mill. Anyway. So this is the type of inventory we're dealing with in British Columbia for forestry, which, as I mentioned, we should have dialed. This is a forest. This isn't the greatest image because I had to clip it out of a PDF, but these mint green polygon areas, those showed up in our vegetation inventory as having whitebark pine in them. But look at how hard-edged those whitebark pine stands are. That's phenomenal how they cut them like that. And it's amazing how they also correspond with things like map edges and things like that. So the way we do inventory in British Columbia, we often do them one map sheet at a time. So what happened here is, this fellow here was really switched on to whitebark and said, I'm going to call some whitebark pine on this mountaintop in this polygon area. And his neighbor down in the next desk over wasn't so into whitebark and didn't think that when he or she were classifying that same area that they wouldn't call any whitebark. So, we have all these odd little gaps like this in our forest inventory in BC, which, this is what we play with on a regular basis there. Then there's timber cruising. These are whitebark. When you cruise plots, you number the trees and you evaluate the form. And these were whitebark pine up on Mount Davidson. And we saw these trees, and they said there was no whitebark pine there, but we saw all these whitebark pine that were painted with cruise numbers on it. So we asked for copies of the cruise records so we could go back to the plots and see them. And sure enough, we found all these whitebark pine, and in the plot they're just called pine, not whitebark or anything. And so we approached the timber cruisers and said, "Can't you call them whitebark pine?" They said, "It doesn't matter. It's just poor form pine. It's just going to get cut down and left on the ground anyway. It doesn't matter." And so the excuse wasn't very fulfilling, let's just say that. So, and they had an excuse that there was no field to fill in whitebark pine. We only play with lodgepole pine, western white pine. So I talked to the cruising software developer, and he said, yes, in fact, there is a field to put in whitebark pine. It's fully acceptable. And so this was also an opportunity where we could have improved our inventory of whitebark pine, because if all these timber cruisers are out there just calling it poor form lodgepole when it's actually pretty good form whitebark, then this would help build our inventory. So anyway, that's another forestry gaffe that we have. Oh, another bad photo. So anyway, this is sort of some improvements that have been made. This is a block near where Charlie's got some work done near Whitetail Lake. And they left a bunch of whitebark pine standing in the block, which was great. This was a Can 4 block, I believe, and there was really very little push from the outside for them to do this. They did this internally, so this is becoming more and more common in forestry in British Columbia, so that's good to see. So changes are happening. And in fact, there are some good things happening in BC with respect to whitebark pine that I shouldn't just say how bad we all are. For example, BC Forest Service staff, they've probably done about 25,000 seedlings in field trials between Michael and Charlie. That's not parents, that's seedlings in total, but still a very good effort. Can4, as we've heard yesterday, is doing some good work. Tech has developed a net positive impact strategy. New Gold has a management plan out. There's a document called Promoting Whitebark Pine Recovery in BC that was funded by Society of Ecosystem Restoration of North Central BC and supported by a government agency. So the government is getting involved here and here, two government things, so that's good. But really, the province at present does have no formal plan, and they're possibly waiting on the federal plan, but we don't really know what exactly they are up to. So what can we do until the province does come around? Just a couple little things is to educate the regional biologists and foresters. As I mentioned, if it came across my desk, I would say get on the make sure whitebark is noted on any permit that goes out. But there's only a couple biologists in BC where you know that whitebark will be noted. And there's a lot of biologists that won't require whitebark management plans if there's an impact happening. Another thing we can do is we can pursue protection under the existing framework, so the Identified Wildlife Strategy, as I mentioned, that's something that needs to get done. And Joanne Vintage out of Fort St. James is really trying to push for that. Unfortunately, Joanne's also retiring within less than a year. So she's been a real advocate for whitebark pine in the BC government, so I'm not sure how that's going to proceed without Joanne. And we need to perhaps just develop management and guidance documents unilaterally, much like we talked about yesterday in the Crown, so that government agencies can at least point to those as good management, best management practices documents, things like that they can point people to say that this is the way things should be done. Perhaps the government didn't pay for them to get done, but at least if they'll support their implementation on the landscape. So in closing, anyway, I won't be doing all this. I had too many beers last night when I wrote this. Anyway, Given that BC has an estimated 42% of the species range, we should be shouldering close to 42% of the recovery efforts. We are not. We're doing the right things. We simply need to do much more. Like, as I mentioned, I point a lot of good things we're doing, but given the vastness of whitebark in BC, we have to do a lot more of what we're doing. So I would say until we do more, we are still the black sheep of whitebark pine, but yeah, hopefully that will change soon. Thanks.